Hello friends, today I am going to talk on Sendai Framework for Action. I am Mr. G.S. Saini, Director of National Civil Defence College and National Fire Service College, Nagpur. We all are aware that in the past 2 decades, there have been a lot of discussion on disaster risk reduction strategies. As an initial part to this, we had the Hugo Framework for Action, which primarily initiated the process of inducing the governments to take up building resilience in community, and then upgraded further, in fact, in another conference which adopted the Sendai Framework for Action. The Sendai Framework for Action primarily has gone beyond what was built up in the Hugo Framework, and subsequently today talks about not only building resilience, but also in reducing losses and damages, which primarily can only be achieved, and reduction of disaster risk can be established with a lot of perseverance and persistence. What we need to look at building explicit focus on people, their health and their livelihoods, and also induce regular follow up for whatever action we have undertaken. Hugo Framework primarily built upon insisting on building resilience for the community, and as a base from the Hugo Framework of Action, the Sendai Framework today aims to achieve an outcome in the next 15 years for substantially reducing the disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihoods and health in the economic, physical, social, cultural and environmental assets of persons, businesses, communities and countries. It is a quite an elaborate arrangement seeking a lot of action to be taken by various governments in all sectors, integrating action not only at the community level, but also for businesses and governments. There is a large amount of commitment which has to be expressed by the federal governments. The realization of the outcome enumerated in the Sendai Framework requires a strong commitment and involvement of the complete political leadership in every country and at all levels in the implementation and follow up of the Sendai Framework, so that we can have the necessary creation of steps which are conducive and which enable the environment protection also. To attain the expected outcome, the goal which we need to pursue has been put across in the Sendai Framework as to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risk through the implementation of integrated and inclusive economic, structural, legal, social, health, cultural, educational, environmental, technological, political and institutional measures that prevent and reduce hazard exposure and vulnerability to disaster, increasing our preparedness for response and recovery, and thus as a result reducing and strengthening our resilience. There are goals which have been established and adopted by the entire world community, and the 7 global targets which have been taken up by the Sendai Framework for Action starts with substantially reducing global disaster mortality by 2030. The goal may be quite big, but subsequently we need to understand that such bigger goals can only be achieved by a cohesive action. The next goal enumerated in the Sendai Framework talks about substantially reducing the number of affected people globally also by 2030. We need to reduce direct disaster economic losses in relation to our GDP, and we are not only talking about the national GDP, but global GDP primarily has to be taken up in reducing the complete amount of economic losses. Substantially reducing disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services, among them health and education facilities taking the largest amount of priority, need to be including in our developing for resilience by 2030. The Sendai Framework document primarily has been more focusing on the health and educational facilities within its framework, so that more action can be initiated in such stages. There are goals primarily which talk about substantially increasing the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. More amount of countries need to contribute and come in, even poorer countries with not having enough amount of infrastructure and strength, both in financial as well as in training, to come and subsequently take assistance from developed countries, so that they can not only take up the global targets and can also achieve them. The next target is enumerated as substantially enhancing international cooperation for developing countries to adequate and sustainable support to complement their national actions for implementation of the Sendai Framework by 2030. There was a lot of conflict and discussion at the World Conference, which primarily spoke about the developing and the lesser developed countries had to be depending upon largely developed countries for support in adoption of the Sendai Framework of action. And this is where primarily this goal has been now included in the entire document, which talks about assistance to be provided by developed countries. The last goal which we have, as far as which we need to achieve, is to substantially increase the availability of and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessments to the people by 2030. We all know that recently, after the tsunami happened in southern India, the warning system has now got established as a lead role being taken by India, and this has been assisting all the countries in the Bay of Bengal to reduce the level of damages as well as risk to their people by giving active warnings for any particular phenomena which may result in a cyclonic storm, or even to an extent a tsunami which may get initiated. There is a large amount of guiding principles which have been formulated in the Sendai Framework. Now, these guiding principles primarily are for the governments, and primarily it is for the national circumstances which needs to be understood, and it has to be consistent with domestic laws as well as international obligations and commitments. The first guiding principle talks about that every state has the primary responsibility to prevent and reduce disaster risk, including through international, regional, sub-regional, transboundary, bilateral cooperation, to the extent to which national disaster risk reduction policies and measures in the context of their respective circumstances and capabilities can be enhanced through the provision of sustainable international cooperation. The guiding principle here itself primarily talks about collective participation, not only at the regional level, but at the national level and even at international level, so that much more bigger level of activity can be initiated, with responsibilities being more felt at the national level. The next guiding principle talks about disaster risk reduction, which requires that responsibilities have to be shared by the central government and relevant national authorities, sectors and stakeholders as appropriate to the national circumstances and systems of governance. The in fact guiding principles will later on will also get translated into priorities of action, and in that it is clearly defined as to what level of actions we need to be initiated by all these authorities, beginning from the central government and percolating down to the states, to the national, to the district level and to the panchayat level organizations. The third guiding principle for all countries to follow is managing the risk of disasters, which is aimed at protecting persons and their property, health, livelihoods and productive assets, as well as cultural environmental assets, while promoting and protecting all human rights, including the right to development. Managing the risk primarily has been right through linked with the right to development, and this primarily needs to be looked at in a very proactive manner, where we need to understand that after a disaster, the opportunity for rightful development always gets created, and primarily for whatever has been destroyed needs to be developed in a manner so that we have a good amount of strategy to ensure that no further damages occur in the same format as what happened in the previous disaster. The fourth guiding principle primarily talks of disaster risk reduction, which requires an all of society engagement and partnership. We have been talking about the community participation, and each and every individual needs to know how to survive during an emergency. He needs to understand the associated risks which primarily are thrown up by each and every phenomena which can result in a disaster, and primarily he needs to build upon such type of information to ensure his own level of risk is reduced. The principle also talks about requiring empowerment and inclusive, accessible and non-discriminatory participation, paying social attention to people disproportionately affected by disasters, especially the poorest. A gender, age, disability and cultural perspective should be integrated in all policies and practices, and women and youth leadership should be promoted. In this context, special attention should be paid to the improvement of organized voluntary work of citizens. In fact, Sendai Framework of document first time talks about voluntary work of citizens, and a larger amount of role can be played by students which primarily are participating in programs which are brought about through NSS. And NSS primarily, which earlier has been only planning on works which look at preparing students for taking them to the village level for sanitation and educating and creating awareness in villages regarding their own health situation. Here primarily we have to look at developing students to also take up the task of making the community and the people aware about the risks and their possible areas in which they can develop to reduce the risks in given format of any hazard which they may be exposed to. The guiding principles primarily also enumerate at the 5th level where we need to manage, which depends on the coordinated action within and across sectors with relevant stakeholders at all levels. It requires the full engagement of all state institutions of an executive and legislative nature at all national and local levels, and a clear articulation of responsibilities across public and private stakeholders, including business and the academia, must be ensured to create mutual outreach, partnership, complementing roles, accountability and follow up. Primarily each and every functionary, when it start understanding their roles, the cohesiveness and the integration primarily to respond to a particular situation will be much higher, and subsequently the success as an outcome to the principles of disaster risk reduction will be much more visible to us. The 6th guiding principle primarily talks about where the enabling, guiding and coordinating role of national and state governments remain essential. It is necessary to empower the local authorities and local communities to reduce disaster risk, including through resources, incentives and decision making responsibilities as wherever they may be appropriate. When we look at the level of strength which needs to be built at the local level, we are not only talking about the community, but we are also talking about all those responding agencies which primarily have a capacity to respond at a local level. We all must remember that resources at a higher level will take time to arrive. It is the authorities at the local level which will be much more arriving earlier at the incident scene, and possibly maybe also having a larger amount of tasks to be done in the golden hour for survival. And keeping that in mind, it is essential that state governments and at the national level also governments must invest in empowering the local authorities and local communities to reduce disaster risk to all the people of this country. The 7th guiding principle primarily comes in the form of disaster risk reduction, which requires a multi-hazard approach and an inclusive risk-informed decision making based on open exchange and dissemination of disintegrated data, including by sex, age and disability, as well as on easily accessible, up-to-date, comprehensive, science-based, non-sensitive risk information complemented by traditional knowledge. We have been talking about primarily a multi-hazard approach, and the Government of India has already listed out the actions primarily at the national level to prepare plans which may have a format which may be having an approach of multi-hazard preparedness. Now, when we talk of multi-hazard preparedness, we must all understand, though we may learn about one phenomena, but this one phenomena which may be a primary hazard can always result in a secondary hazard. We may have an earthquake hitting in a particular area, but that earthquake can also result in certain embankments collapsing and we may have flooding situation. There can be an industrial area as it happened in Japan. You can have a fire in industrial area, there can be a leakage, or you can have a nuclear disaster also happening because of what happened as a consequence to a earthquake which happened in Japan. Primarily what we need to understand is that every phenomena which has a potential to create a disaster will throw multiple hazards at us, and we need to prepare ourselves and reduce the risk against such multiple hazards, and primarily the decision making and learning has to begin from such a level of approach. The 8th guiding principle comes in the form of development, strengthening and implementation of relevant policies, plans, practices, mechanisms that need to aim at coherence as appropriate across sustainable development and growth, food security, health and safety, climate change and vulnerability, environmental management and disaster risk reduction agendas. Now, whenever we set about an agenda, we need to understand that somewhere whatever we need to contribute, that should strengthen our development planning and as well as should strengthen reduction in risk for whatever may come at a later future. The 9th principle talks about there are drivers of disaster risk which may be local, national, regional or global in scope, but disaster risks have local and specific characteristics that must be understood for the determination of measures to reduce disaster risk. It is very clear that when we have under the same framework of action, more focus at the local level has to be brought in for people to understand the level of risk which are being potentially people are getting exposed to, and making people aware and also preparing them to face such risks should be the priority which we must take to reduce such type of risks. We also have a guiding principle which talks about addressing underlying disaster risk factors through disaster risk informed public and public investments in most cost effective than primary reliance on post disaster response and recovery, which contributes to sustainable development. When we are talking of sustainable development, we need to understand that investments in more disaster risk informed public and primarily in building resilience is what will take us in a long way to establishing a community, a society which will know how to survive in a given situation. Primarily addressing the factors which primarily look at reducing risk, we need to understand information and risk informed public are both contributors largely to reduce disaster risk in a given area. The guiding principle 11 talks about in a post disaster recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction. It is critical to prevent the creation of and to reduce disaster risk by building back better and increasing public education and awareness of the disaster risk. It's sad when we talk about people in fact going and buying a house, but not bothering to seek information from the person selling a house whether the entire parameters applicable for that region have been incorporated, which has been given in the form of the National Building Code to us. And this is where in a post disaster recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction phase, what we need to understand is that though in a certain parlance we may not be in a position to create or to repair or to retrofit the present structures, but certainly the potential which we get after a disaster strikes, we need to understand that we must prepare plans for building back better, so that the same level of damage, the same level of risk should not get created, and increasing public education and awareness to such level of activity will always go forward in not only adopting such strategies, but also overall reducing the risk, so that the number of people who may get affected as a result of any particular phenomena will be much more lesser. The last guiding principle which the Sendai Framework brings about is for implementation of an effective and meaningful global partnership and the further strengthening of the international cooperation, including the fulfillment of respective commitments of official development assistance by developed countries, which are essential for effective disaster risk management. we are primarily looking forward to such type of global partnerships, and our government has taken up building up partnership with the local South Asian countries and assisting them in not only sharing information with regard to warning, but also assisting them with substantial amount of money in building back better after every particular disaster. The Nepal earthquake primarily is one incident which we all know. Primarily, India was the first one to go and assist the people who were in distress. And this is where the strengthening of the international cooperation happens to be the biggest challenge which has been taken up, and India is taking a lead in this particular level of activity. Friends, when we talk about the guiding principles, the last guiding principle, primarily looking at developing countries, in particular, the least developed countries, small island developing states, landlocked developing countries and African countries, as well as middle income and other countries facing specific disaster risk challenges, they need adequate, sustainable and timely provision of support, which includes not only finance, but technology transfer and capacity building from developed countries. And there is a good amount of partnership which needs to be tailored to their needs and priorities as identified by each one of such countries. India has taken a lead, and the SARC Center primarily is organizing a good amount of training activity. The National Disaster Management Authority was also taken up works by which other countries are getting assisted, and there are Indian institutes which are getting people from the South Asian countries, where they come, they learn, level of skills are enhanced, and they go back to their countries to practice the level of disaster risk reduction strategies within their own countries. There are 4 basic priorities which have been set up as far as the Sendai Framework of Action is concerned. And building upon what Hugo Framework of Action brought in, the first priority which was established for the Sendai Framework was to instill in people an understanding to know what disaster risk comprises of. And as a policy matter, as a matter of practice for disaster management, it should be based on understanding of disaster risk in all its dimensions of vulnerability, capacity, exposure of person and assets, hazards characteristics and environment. Such knowledge can be leveraged from the purpose of pre-disaster risk assessment for prevention and mitigation, and for development and implementation of appropriate preparedness and effective response to disasters. All policies, all planning, all guidelines framed at various levels primarily do talk about disaster risk management, and they do talk about preparing people so that they are enough skilled, they have enough information, enough capacity to counter any particular emergency they face. The second priority for action as per Sendai Framework talks about strengthening disaster risk governance. Disaster risk governance at the national, regional and global levels is of great importance for an effective and efficient management of disaster risk. We need to have clear vision. Our plans should be primarily very properly planned and as well as very clear in their vision. They should focus on developing competence. Guidance must be given for people to build capacities, and we need to understand that coordination within and across sectors will be an essential element of all actions that will be needed for disaster risk governance. It will also look at participation of relevant stakeholders where needed, and primarily all these stakeholders in coordination know their own responsibility and are accountable for their actions. Strengthening disaster risk governance for prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery and rehabilitation is therefore necessary and fosters collaboration and partnership across mechanisms and institutions for the implementation of instruments relevant to disaster risk reduction and achievable sustainable development. Primarily, the priorities of action has been quite detailed in the Sendai Framework of Action, which talks about the relative level of activity which needs to be created at each and every level. The third priority of action which has been taken up in the Sendai Framework talks about public and private investment in disaster risk prevention and reduction through structural and non-structural measures which are essential to enhance the economic, social, health and cultural resilience of persons, communities, countries and their assets, as well as the environment. These can be the drivers for innovation, for growth and job creation. Such measures are cost effective and instrumental to save lives, prevent and reduce losses, and ensure effective recovery and rehabilitation. And as a matter of priority, the public and private partnership in India is quite apparent, and a large number of interventions are being planned with various agencies both in the industry and in the private sector also. We are looking at enhancing disaster preparedness as the fourth priority of action. Enhancing disaster preparedness will start with three broad things which we need to plan for. The steady growth of disaster risk, including the increase of people and assets exposure combined with lessons learned from the past disasters, indicates the need for further strengthening disaster preparedness for response and taking action in anticipation of events, integrating disaster risk reduction in response preparedness, and ensuring that capacities are in place for effective response and recovery at all levels. In fact, it is specifically mentioned that empowering women and persons with disabilities to publicly lead and promote gender equitable and universally accessible response, recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction approaches will be the key aspect for the entire action in this priority, which we primarily have to practice. Disasters have demonstrated that recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction phase needs to be prepared ahead of disaster, and as a critical opportunity to build back better, we must include integrating disaster risk reduction into our development measures and making nations and communities as far as possible more resilient to any particular phenomena which may result in a disaster. Friends, coming to the end of my presentation, we must understand that the Sendai Framework document is an excellent form of action-oriented plan, which primarily has been made to build on elements which ensure continuity with the work done by states and other stakeholders under the Hugo framework for action, and introduces a number of innovations as called for during consultations and negotiations. Many commentators have identified the most significant shift as a strong emphasis to disaster risk management as opposed to disaster management. The definition of 7 global targets, the reduction of disaster risk as an expected outcome, a goal focused on preventing new risk, reducing existing risk, and strengthening resilience, as well as set of guiding principles which primarily include responsibility of states to prevent and reduce disaster risk, all of society and all of state institutions engagement, and primarily making people accountable for the actions what they need to take. Thank you very much.